They were more surprised when we actually announced an open source initiative. And we actually just celebrated our first year birthday. And we'll be talking a little bit about that as well. Now, I did actually come up with an agenda. And because Dell is really new to the open source space, but we're doing a lot of different, what we consider exciting things and getting great feedback from the community, we've actually had wanted to have a couple people join us. So we have our friends from Morph Labs and from Media Temple also here, and they're going to be sharing some insights as well. And then we're going to wrap up with maybe some interesting things in terms of a case study that we've implemented actually internally through one of our divisions at Dell in the security space, and I think you'll find that interesting as well. Now, the first thing I kind of wanted to mention is, why are we interested in open source? And my group is a rather interesting group. It's made up of software people, primarily that came from outside of the company, primarily that came from startups. I sold my company in 2007 to Dell, which was a software company. Stayed in that environment for a couple of years and then migrated over into the product group, where I started the current group that we're working in now. That group is focused on emerging technologies, and in particular emerging technologies that have rapid adoption patterns and rapid revenue patterns in the industry, and where there's an opportunity for Dell to differentiate. And what we're trying to do is identify those trends and initiatives early, identify how we can build solutions, and solutions are very important to us, which consist of hardware, software, and services, and quickly get them into the market. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, one of the reasons we chose open source is because of some learnings that we had through a division called the Data Center Solutions Group, where we helped to build out some of the largest hyperscale environments in the world. These are all brand names. We all log into them every day. They're using primarily Dell hardware solutions. But in the course of working with them to fulfill orders that sometimes mounted in the tens of thousands of servers, we gained a lot of knowledge about how they run their business. And we began to see a paradigm shift. And we believe that paradigm shift is actually going to take over the industry. And we believe a lot of what we're seeing there is going to be driven by open source initiatives. And I want to talk a little bit about that as we're going through this. The other reason we are embracing an open source strategy at the company, not only in software but also in hardware, is that we believe this creates a different type of relationship between Dell and its customers. What we've experienced since we've engaged in this is a closer relationship to our customers, a more collaborative relationship with them, where we're talking about development ideas as we're thinking of those ideas, and our customers are actually helping us to in a collaborative manner to actually develop many of our new products, many of our new capabilities. Now, in the end, we also need to drive revenue. And so we do believe that revenue is a noble goal in the open source area, and we believe there are ways that the industry is going to shift so that revenue will be achieved, and that people will continue to be able to make investments back in open source communities. And that's going to, again, increase customer satisfaction. Now, I want to share some perspectives that we have on open source software, and in particular, some surveys. But I first want to start by just talking a little bit about Gartner. And in the traditional world of IT, when you go in and you sit down with a CIO, one of the first things they're going to do is, before they meet with you, is they're going to read a Gartner analyst report on your company. And that Gartner analyst report is going to give a perspective. This is the famous Gartner hype cycle. If you look at it closely, you'll see that at the peak there of inflated expectations actually sits cloud computing. On its way up, coming up on that side, climbing to the peak of inflated expectations, is big data. And at the very beginning is DevOps. And so I think it's important to kind of think about this in the way that traditional analysts that look at the IT community and look at projects that are going on, think about the world, and then I find it interesting to kind of map some of the open source projects along the lines of what's going on in the view of the analyst in the industry and in the world. And as you can see, there's a variety of maturity models here and adoption paths in terms of where open source projects fit. I just happened to pick a couple here, one of which is very mature in terms of the canonical solution around an OS. OpenStack, which, you know, if you listen to the analysts, it's right at the top in terms of peak of inflated expectations. And then one of our projects, which is the Purple Bunny, and does anybody know what the name of that project is in the room?
Crowbar?
Interesting, Crowbar, yeah. So Crowbar is our initiative that we launched about a year ago, and it's a software initiative that we have in the industry with a software community, and we're getting active contributions. Now, the other perspective I wanted to share is, you know, what are the top 4 questions a CIO gets asked by their board? And this is something I always lead with when I go out and talk to our customers. Well, you know, the first question they get asked right now is, what are you doing with the cloud? Because the board, of course, wants to do what Business Week mentions in their articles and adopt that as fast as they can because they believe that is the new way to run their business. The next question they get asked is, what are you doing with big data? Because we all know that if you have any type of data in your company, it should be a revenue stream, and you should be monetizing it. And the board is learning that, you know, companies really don't have to sell products anymore. They just need to take the data they collect and they can turn that into a form of revenue streams. So CIOs are talking about how do they do that in their environment. The next thing is, what are you doing with security? And these aren't really in priority order, but you can imagine the conversation a CIO might be having as they're giving a briefing on the corporate strategy around their IT department. Security is always top of mind. You know, are we open for a breach? If there's a new virus that was talked about on CNN, it's going to be brought up in a board meeting. And then the last one, of course, is, hey, we can give you less money and you need to do more with it. This is the current environment within boardrooms of both big companies and small companies. I actually think there's a 5th question here that's being asked all the time right now, and it's, what are you doing with open source? And every CIO, and I just got back from Europe, I was in China recently, I travel around the US quite a lot, I spend most of my time in the field with customers. Every CIO I run into is talking about open source. That's a really radical shift for me in terms of people's interest in adopting open source. But when you look at the trends, and I want to show you some survey results here, you'll see that in this survey, and I have several different surveys here from Northbridge, Venture Capital, from 451, and actually some other informal surveys that were conducted. None of these surveys are done by Dell. So they're all independent surveys that we just pulled together and we're sharing with you. But by 2016, 50% or more of all software deployed, purchased, etc., is going to be open source software. That's a radical shift, a radical paradigm shift for what's going on in the industry. And then if you start to think about, well, why is this occurring? There's no one single reason that dominates. If you look at this particular slide, the dark green sections, their experience with open source has been very positive. Public sector adoption for open source is growing. Economic downturn forcing, you know, economic decisions about how they invest, especially when they get a big renewal contract for maintenance or new licenses. That's when we see our inflection point coming for people engaging with us. And then people are really tired of vendor locking. I remember in the early days of OpenStack, and I was the executive sponsor that brought it into Dell, I sat down with the CIO in Boston of a major financial house. That's where I live, but I'm really never there. And we were talking about OpenStack, and I said to him, so look, Dell's really wrestling with whether or not we need to do a distro. What do you think? And he said, you know, we're really wrestling with whether or not we really need to have a support model for open source anymore. Because we think we're mature enough now, we can participate in the communities as a user, and we can take trunk, and we can implement the trunk code, and we're not really sure we need a go-between anymore. And that company is actually out deploying some of the new initiatives in open source, and they're actually doing it not with a licensed distro right now. So that's another big inflection point that I think we all have to think about in terms of the adoption curve. And if you start to look at it in terms of where, you know, customers are going to adopt open source, you know, this survey revealed that over 40% of the adoption is going to be in the enterprise. That's, again, another major inflection point. Now, when you think about the market segments, there's no real radical outlier here. Certainly services is a big adopter of open source, and I think that's a trend that has always gone on. I used to run the services organization for Nortel, we felt that open source was a key to our strategy. Why? We were always running into things that our engineers forgot to do in the products, in the code, and we had to compensate. We had to compensate through some form of a managed service. We didn't have a lot of resources in services to go do development, so we were always trying to be creative. And many times we just couldn't go through either the cycle time of trying to buy something. You start to look back on some of the justifications you had. Many times we were trying to avoid contract negotiations through our own contractual legal department. And so we would use open source instead because we didn't have to ask permission. So I think services is a pretty normal trend. But I think as you move to the left of this, you start to see other more mainstream areas like retail, manufacturing, and mining as adopting open source, and open source solutions cross their IT infrastructure. Now, another interesting part is that when you start to break that down, where are the most recent opportunities? In other words, who's adopting it the fastest? And I thought this was pretty surprising that health and medical insurance areas and sciences were one of the fastest adopters. And the reason that's a surprise to me is because in my former company, we did a lot with compliance. And compliance and HIPAA were always really big issues. And I always found that segment of the industry to be somewhat reluctant to try new things because it always meant regulatory discussions that they just didn't want to have. And so this really indicates a change, I think, in that perspective. Now, as you move into the next area I found interesting was, what are the real reasons people are choosing to move to an open source environment? Increased flexibility and lower cost. Okay, so keep that in mind, right? Those are the two major reasons that people responded. Kind of an interesting, makes sense to me. Well, then you actually go to the next slide that we have here. After you adopted it, what was the primary benefit? And if you look at this, lower cost and increased flexibility. So all of a sudden, their expectations are being met. How many of us can say that about a product that we bought and brought into, our company or our house? Our expectations are always met. I mean, that's pretty unusual. Now, the next thing that they kind of revealed was, okay, what are the cost savings that were achieved here? Did you meet your expectations? Did you exceed your expectations? And if you look at this carefully, it's almost 90% said that it met or exceeded their cost expectations. And in fact, some of the discussions that we're having, for instance, recently with the head of a major government organization, this happens to be in the security space, that's adopting a big data open source solution. Their question to me was, when do I begin retirement? This was very interesting. I was in a room and I'd been talking, whiteboarding for about 4 hours with this organization. They do a lot of top secret type stuff, so they wouldn't really tell me what they were doing. But at the end of it, the CIO kind of stops, and all the technical people had been, kind of grilling me for a long time. And he looks at me and goes, okay, when can I start turning off my systems? And the whole room got really quiet. And you could just tell they didn't want me to give a date. They didn't want me to say yes. And my answer was kind of clear to him. He said, I don't think we figured that out yet. I said, I think it's individual for every organization in terms of what you've done with your open source deployment, the maturity, the confidence, the high availability, the system they happen to be implementing, they were having great results with, but I happen to point out to them that it had some major high availability flaws. I was kind of surprised that they were using that, and they said, well, they were using it because of the phenomenal cost benefit they had gotten, the phenomenal performance and return on investment they had gotten. But now he wanted to turn off the legacy systems. And he said, my team, and he looked at them, they were in the room, he goes, my team won't let me turn them off. And I said, well, okay, let's have a conversation. And we actually whiteboarded out a conversation about when could they turn it off, what would be the criteria or the decision for that. And so I think that's kind of an interesting example of somebody adopting open source, getting great success, but they're still not ready to cut over completely without a lifeline. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to share with you, those are some thoughts about what we're seeing in the industry perspectives. I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about innovation and innovation examples, and share with you some of the things that we think are important and that we're actually active in today. So the Open Compute Project, how many people know about that? Okay, a few people in the room. Okay, the Open Compute Project we've been active in for quite a while. It's open source hardware. Okay, kind of an interesting thing. Really didn't have much traction a couple of years ago. Facebook kind of stepped up with a couple other vendors, decided to lead the industry down a path, and actually is really, I think, getting really good traction, getting really good collaboration going on in the industry. We've been active in that for quite a long time. The Open Data Center Alliance. The thing I like about this particular initiative is that it's really struggling or focusing on being customer driven. So many of the aspects of the ODCA is to get customers to drive what they need for requirements and what they need performance. Is anybody involved in this, in the ODCA here? Okay. And then, of course, you've heard a lot about OpenStack. We had OpenStack Day yesterday. I think the last one in here that I wanted to mention was the Dell Crowbar initiative, which is our own. And I was actually having breakfast with some folks this morning that I hadn't met. I just sat down and started talking with them. And they were actually giving a talk on how to start an open source community. And I just said, oh, this would be great. Can I just pick your brain for the next 20 minutes? Because we're actually doing something that's never been done before at our company. We went off, came up with a piece of software, decided not to actually sell it, which kind of created very interesting conversations for me and the accountants and the lawyers, and then said to everybody, well, we're going to release it and give it away for free. And don't worry about it because it's going to create value for the organization. It's going to create value for the company. But in terms of running an open source community, we're only a year old. And some of the things we're learning very quickly, other organizations have been doing for a long time. And with this particular breakfast that I had, I learned a great deal in about 15 minutes about ways that we should be changing our community and the way we're running it for adoption. And again, we're small. We're still acquiring contributors, and we're getting what we consider extremely good feedback from our install base. But we're also new and we're learning. Now, I have our ARM server in here. How many people know what an ARM is? ARM chip. Okay, good. Okay, how many people know that Dell actually announced one and is shipping? Okay, just a couple. All right, so why was this important to us and how does it relate to open source? Well, guess what? If you think up a new piece of hardware and there's no software to run on it, then the community will never be able to adopt it. And so somebody actually has to step back as a manufacturer of hardware or a builder of hardware and say, you know what, I really believe in this. I believe this technology will go, and we're going to place a bet on it. And Dell is in the business of placing bets. We may, the legacy Dell, you may think, is not very risk-oriented, is a manufacturing organization that is great at, manufacturing. The new Dell is not. And I'm talking about the Dell that I joined in 2007 is totally different than the Dell that I live in today. We're very much risk-oriented. And so this is an example of thought leadership in the industry where we got together with a bunch of component manufacturers and actually committed to building out an ARM-based server that we released. And I think now you'd say, okay, well, how does that relate to open source? Well, you have to start to look at the community now that's coming together and is actually working to deliver not only a hardware offering in this space, but also software capabilities around this. And Dell's going to contribute as well by using our Crowbar provisioning framework to actually provision a solution, and we'll be working on that as well as part of this. Again, something you may not know about Dell, you may not know about the innovation that's going on in the industry. And then we have this other little project that we're doing, and this is all going to tie together at the end, called Project Sputnik. Anybody heard of Project Sputnik? Okay, well, if you haven't gone by our booth, you should go by our booth. It's a very, very attractive laptop that runs Linux, and it's targeted at developers. We started it as what we would call a skunkworks incubation project that's personally kind of overseen by somebody on the executive staff. And it starts with seed money. So if you're in a startup business, which is where I came from, that's always very important. The person sponsoring the idea gets seed money. In this case, I think it was about $150,000. And go ahead, go see what you can do. So we came up with this idea. The fellow's actually here who came up with it and has been championing it. It just exploded. Just exploded in terms of people wanting it, adoption, and we really hadn't really thought about how we would actually take it to market and make it a product. The speed at which we move is very, very fast in these instances, and today we actually announced that we will be making it available as a product very shortly. and we actually began to show a little bit of the vision for what we're thinking about with this product. So you're a developer, and you want a cool laptop that's lightweight that you can do your development on. And you want to be writing, you know, in a Linux type stack. And so we can provide that. But really what we think you really need is an entire environment. And really what our thought process is here is that you need end-to-end consumption of IT resources. And you want that based on having what you need available at your fingertips and being able to get whatever you need from the cloud. And in order to do that, you're going to need the entire industry of both open source, non-open source, service organizations, people like Media Temple, people like Morph Labs, to help us pull together a capability that enables you to do this. So you can imagine a capability where you get a hold of a Sputnik, you start developing, you have a little micro cloud on your Sputnik, and now you want to promote that cloud back up into a different environment so that you can take advantage of that bigger environment. And you don't want to have to make any changes to it. And you want that promotion to be very, very simple. And so one of our visions to this environment is that would be an end-to-end experience for our customers in terms of promoting that. Okay, the next thing we wanted to do was have Morph Labs share with you some of the innovation that they're doing. And so I'm going to turn it over to Winston.